All right. So we are back. Let me get on the right slide here. Okay, so we're on the Fourth Amendment. So another constitutional provision, Fourth Amendment. We kind of think of it in the criminal context that we are protected against unreasonable searches and seizures unless there's probable cause, right? So in the environmental context, right, we have our environmental laws and we want to police them. We want to make sure that they are companies and individuals are following the rules. Um, but if some sort of investigation of compliance with environmental statutes involves either a search or a seizure, it would implicate the Fourth Amendment. So here's an example. Courts have held that aerial mapping cameras are okay for environmental investigation. So you have I don't know, a drone or a plane that's taking pictures from the air to see maybe what things are going to be done, what the wetlands are looking like, things like that. So courts have found that there is no expectation of privacy from the air, and since camera technology isn't something that's crazy out of the out of the woodwork, that's not an unreasonable search. Um, just anecdotally, in the news, we had that Chinese balloon that went from, where did it go? It went from, oh darn it, my cat is on the keyboard. That went from, what was it, like Idaho to North Carolina? All right, I'm pausing this and I'm going to feed the cat. Okay, the cat is happy now. But back to there. So just recently, the there was a Chinese balloon that went from Idaho down to Montana. Oh no, through Montana, and then went actually to the Carolinas, and then the military shot it down when it was out over the Atlantic. But so then I guess we have an expectation of privacy from the air from foreign governments, but regular people don't, and that was held to not be an unreasonable search. Other tools. So this is super interesting. Is the geographic information system, which is some sort of computerized mapping system. And you get the information from satellite images and aerial photography, and yeah, so they can monitor things like wetlands, or in cases of some kind of emergency, say there's like a chemical leak or something, they can pinpoint the location of where the fire departments are, the hospitals are, how many, the population density, or even the weather, to see like where the wind flow is going, who could be at risk. um, and it'll allow, who has to either evacuate or have a boil order and things like that. So that helps the first responders. So I mean, every little area might have their own GIS. This is just a link to the Indiana ones, and it's slow. Um, and I'm not even going to do all the tools because it really takes forever to do it. But I would recommend that you take some time and have fun with it. I couldn't find the Illinois one when I was searching, but you can do things like, oh, I want to look at waterways, or I want to look at roads, or I want to look at borders, of like cities and towns. So I say, yeah, so agriculture, boundaries, climate, economy, elevation. Okay, I understand. Um, so you can add like whatever data you like to this, and come up with your imagery. So that must have been elevation there that I just showed. Okay, so these are just the boundaries in Indiana. And look at that. That's kind of topography there. Because obviously Indiana, it's all flat. Takes forever. Okay. Yeah, it starts filling in. Okay, so there's Indiana with all the little borders. Let me see, Waters, what happens there when I go to Waters? Oh, I gotta, I don't know. I'll add this. Anyway, it takes a while just because I have other things up, but this GIS, each kind of state, each area is going to have access to their version of this, and have access to some nice data in the GIS. So I guess that's also probably why the courts have found that there's no expectation of privacy, because they know that these, the satellites and these computerized mapping systems exist. So that's your search. And we talked also about, there are warrant opportunities under the environmental statutes, and they can ask for the warrants. Usually, companies and facilities want to be forthcoming and allow the EPA on their site even without a warrant, because they know then they'll have some front notice of it, and they will be able to be prepared, and they want to appear, or hopefully they want to be in compliance and show the EPA that they're cooperative and in compliance, and they don't have anything to worry about. Um, so a seizure, so that's search. So now on seizure is like taking possession of something by a law enforcement official. I always think of like drug dealers. They get their like mansions and their Maseratis seized um, by the feds. So the courts have found in the environmental context that if the government asserts control over a property, right? We talked about this a second ago when we were talking about takings. Um, Even if the owner is not displaced, or somehow they can't control what's going on with their property, like an environmental cleanup, they might call that a seizure, which again they can't do without probable cause, maybe a warrant, um, maybe specific statutory authority to do that. Due process and equal protection. So due process, you're talking about due process all the time, right? The government can't take anything from you without a process, without going through a certain process. So our Fifth Amendment, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. 14th Amendment, nor shall any state deprive, oops, that doesn't work. The highlighting doesn't work on PowerPoint. Life, liberty, or property without due process, so this is, you're adding on the equal protection, nor deny any person the equal protection of the laws. So everybody is entitled to the protection of the laws applied in an equal way. Okay, so procedural due process, right? We have to jump through the hoops, through the procedures, or the government has to jump through the hoops before they are going to somehow deprive someone of life, liberty, or property. So before I go to jail, right, there has to be, indictment, um, maybe it has to go through like a grand jury, and then you have to go through a trial, and then the jury has to find me guilty for me to go to jail, right? Same thing in environmental context. So if somehow the government is trying to restrict my use of property, they have to go through a process. Okay, so if they are going to be fined, if they are going to be enjoined, right, they're going to have a stop order on work, the party isn't entitled to notice that it's going to happen and a hearing before this can happen. So you can, it's not like you can't deprive somebody of a right, but you just have to go through the steps, jump through the hoops. Due process usually means notice to the parties and some sort of hearing, right? Some sort of hearing of the facts before who might be a non-biased decision maker. So maybe it's an administrative law judge. Maybe it goes up to a real judge. And the the more serious the deprivation, right, the worse deprival of life, liberty, or property, the more process is required. So if it's going to be like a fine of $50, right? We've had traffic tickets, right? We can go in to traffic court, and say, no, we didn't, I want to look at that camera video because I stopped at that stop sign, or I didn't run that red light. So that's the red light camera. Just the red light camera is enough, but then you can appeal it. So they give the example in the book, that if a kid does something bad in school and she's suspended, what do they get? They don't really get a big hearing, but the teacher brings them to the principal's office, and then the principal talks to them, maybe asks a couple of people what happened, and makes the decision to suspend them, per the code of conduct. So that's like a very minor process. But, imprisonment, we just talked about all the process you have to go to before you can put somebody in jail. So whatever you're trying to do property wise, there are processes, right? Like, zoning, how to get a variance, permits to build, permits to emit things into the air, or to discharge things into the water or the ground, right? All of those rules have an appropriate process set up in the statute, in the law. So you have to, the government cannot just like say, no, you can't do this, unless they have followed the processes that are required under the law. Okay, so that's your process part, procedural due process. And now here's your equal protection. So you can't treat similarly situated parties in an unequal fashion. So when you look at the book, they talk about like that. Oh, and I think it's on the next slide here. The classification of the party, or the similar or the situated parties, and the government, like the higher the level, if you're classifying somebody by economic basis, that's a pretty lower standard for the government. But if it's something like race, that's a suspect class. If it's a suspect class, then the government has a higher burden um, to justify any unequal treatment of similarly situated parties. Um, Environmental law, it is usually an economic classification, and that would be, a lighter burden. So there's different kinds of challenges. So the facial challenge is like the law as it is written is unconstitutional. It violates the Equal Protection Clause, or as applied. Okay, so the law itself looks good, but they're only denying zoning variances to a certain religious group. So they're saying, well, as you're applying this zoning reg, you're applying it to someone, to only this religious group, and not, to other people. So it's maybe on its face it's okay, but as they're applying it in this situation, it violates equal protection. Spot zoning is where they're like creating some sort of, there's like one piece of land that is not zoned the same way as everywhere else. So that would be, suspect. So let me just show you this. Okay, so your classification, if it's an economic classification, then, your justification has to just be, it's rational. It's a rational justification. I'm trying to figure out this chart here. If it's a mid-level type of classification by gender, or if someone is illegitimate or something like that, then it has to be a little bit higher standard. It has to be a substantial relationship between why they're doing this and the governmental interest. And then these suspect classes, race, fundamental rights like religion, that has to be a compelling interest. So it has to be a pretty high standard for them to overcome that. Okay, so let's take a break because I think our next little assignment is talking about the Fourth Amendment. So in our module for your written assignment for the week is to do assignment 4.3, which is on page 95, and it talks about the Fourth Amendment. So I'm going to stop this lecture and give you some opportunity while this is fresh in your head to look at assignment 4.3 and start that. And then I'll move on